Hi everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're going to continue on with our story, A Witch in a Fix by Marian Broderick by O'Brien Press. What's happened is that Anna, who's an apprentice witch, has actually turned one of her teachers that she didn't like very much into a huge rat, and all sorts of things are happening. So we're going to find out what happens next. Chapter 7, The Truth Spell. I was kicking a football against a fence in the playground when the dreaded message came. Anna, said Mary, popping her head out of a nearby window, you're to go to Mrs. Winkle's office immediately. Thanks, I said. Just what I needed. What have you done? Said Mary. Is it something to do with that old rat? Why would it have anything to do with me? I said quickly. It's probably because I was late today or something. Okay, said Mary, drawing her head back in. Good luck. I booted the ball over the fence. I went inside and trailed down the hallway until I got a closed door. On it was a sign in large black letters. Mrs. Winkle, head teacher. I took a deep breath, knocked and entered. Well, 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 said Mrs. Winkle, glancing up from her desk and fixing me on the spot with her blue-eyed gaze. If it isn't my special pupil, Anna Kelly. Good morning, Mrs. Winkle, I said in a wobbly voice. At school, no one but me knew that Mrs. Winkle was not only a head teacher, but also a very senior witch. But even though no one knew that she'd magic powers, everyone in school respected her. Her methods were that she called them firm but fair, which basically meant you didn't mess her around. But I was about to mess her around big time. I was about to look her in the eye and tell lies, and that made me want to jump on the first plane to Australia. I shifted from one foot to the other and prayed I wouldn't crack. She started off friendly enough. How are your magic studies going, Anna? She said. Been out to any interesting workshops lately? No, miss, I said, trying to avoid her gaze. I've been studying at home mainly. And what about your practical magic? She said, peering over her glasses. Done any good experiments? My heart thumped loudly inside my chest. No, miss, I said, twisting the bottom of my jumper in my sweaty hands. Are you sure, Anna? She said. No shape-shifting, for example? I know how fond you are of that particular trick. There was a pause. No, miss, I lied in a tiny voice. Mrs. Winkle rose out of her chair and walked around to face me. She leant against a large silver box on her desk. I recognised that box because she used it sometimes when we were doing sorcery lessons together. It was her magic box. But what was it doing here? I gulped. It is very odd, don't you think, she said, that you were the last person to see Mrs. Coffey last night. That's not my fault, I said. And then suddenly a very large rat shows up in school, said Mrs. Winkle, as if I hadn't spoken. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to take a dislike to you, Anna. I don't know why that was, miss, I said. By now my hands were dripping sweat onto the floor and I badly wanted to go to the loo. Mrs. Winkle watched me fidget and her eyes narrowed. You're hiding something from me, Anna, she said, and that's very disappointing. I hung my head and felt my cheeks going red with shame. Upsetting Mrs. Winkle was the last thing I wanted to do, but I couldn't tell her the truth. I just couldn't. Mrs. Winkle turned to the magic box and opened it. If you think, my dear young witch, she said, that I'm not going to get to the bottom of this business, you can think again. She whipped around to face me and I nearly jumped out of my skin, for in her hand she held a long silver wand and she was pointing it right at me. Time for a little truth spell, I think, she said. My heart missed a beat. Mrs. Winkle, please, I whined. I am telling the truth. No, Anna, said Mrs. Winkle, I'm afraid you're not. She raised her arms in the air and chanted, Meet my eyes and count to 3, and in a heartbeat you will see that though you panic, prance or pout, when I ask, the truth comes out. She fixed her blue eyes on me. I found I could not look away, try as I might. Immediately I felt my insides go swimmy and my nose itch. Mrs. Winkle's eyes bored into my brain, making it feel like jelly. 1, I said, dribbling slightly. I didn't want to count to 3. I just couldn't stop myself. This was strong magic from a true expert. 2, I said. I knew that after I said 3, the next words out of me would be the whole story about Mrs. Coffey. 3, I said. Last night I... Tat-tat-tat-tat. The sound of loud knocking on the office door broke my trance. Mrs. Winkle groaned. She took her eyes off mine and lowered her wand. Who is it? She called. Police, madam, a deep voice answered. Can we have a word? Mrs. Winkle dropped her wand back into the magic box and bustled to the door. She opened it and I heard the sound of murmuring. A truth spell needs to be eyeball-to-eyeball contact, so once Miss Winkle wasn't staring at me, the magic started to drift off. I shook my head to clear my brain a little. That was close, but she'd be back in a minute. I eyed the open magic box in front of me and the beautiful silver key on the table beside it. Mrs. Winkle and the police officer were talking. No one was looking at me. I sneaked over to the top box. There just had to be something. There could be something to help me, but what? I traced the pretty silver pattern with my fingers. Yes, officer, I'll come now, said Mrs. Winkle. Thank you. Rats, she was coming back. There was no time. I sprang away from the box. If you think you're off the hook, Anna, you can think again, she said, frowning. But that's all for now. Right, miss, I said, sighing with relief. Any time, miss. She picked up the silver key and locked the magic box. She dropped the key in the top drawer of her desk. Out you go, she said. I'm needed in the playground. Yes, miss, I said. A new naughty plan started to form in my brain. Mrs. Winkle put on her raincoat, shooed me out of her office and strode down the corridor without a backward glance. I dawdled back to the playground thinking of the magic box and how I knew now I knew where the silver key was kept. And I'm ashamed to say, I smiled. Later that night, I put my trainers and stuffed an old witch's hat and wand into my bag. My plan was to break into the school and find out if anything in Mrs. Winkle's magic box could help me solve the problem of Mrs. Cuffy. There just had to be all sorts of cool stuff in that box. Maybe there was a potion to make you invisible or a spell to make you fly. Everyone said I was too young to do all that stuff yet, but no one could stop me if I was on my own, could they? Of course, Charlie wanted to come too. He wound himself around my legs, pleading with his golden eyes. No chance, Charlie, I said, wagging my finger at him. This is not a job for a cat. You'd only try and gobble her up. You know you would. Charlie wasn't a bit happy. He created a huge fuss, yowling and climbing up my legs. Ow, I said. Shush, you'll wake the aunties. Eventually, I shook him off, and he had flounced into a corner in a sulk. I opened the window of my bedroom and climbed out into the night. I made my way to St. Munchkin's through the deserted streets. It was deathly quiet. I wished I was tucked up in my warm bed like everyone else instead of creeping through the night like a burglar. How did I get myself into these situations? So Munchkins looked massive, black and scary at night. The black iron gates were locked, so I squeezed through the gap in the fence in the playground. I knew that one of the windows of the corridor had a broken catch, so I crept along, testing each window. Every time a branch creaked or a bird flapped, it felt like my heart leapt into my mouth. A nervous sweat broke out in my forehead and dribbled into my eyes. Finally, I found the right window and I climbed through it into the school. The school corridor was even spookier than the playground. There was no lights on, but a full moon shone through the windows. The jagged shadows of the trees swayed back against the wall. They twisted as if dancing to wild music that no human could hear. I crept into Mrs. Winkle's room, held my breath and pushed open the door. My heart felt as if it was going to burst as I crept into her office and towards her desk. There sat the silver box, glinting in a beautiful pool of magical moonlight. I went to the top drawer of the desk, opened it, and there was a silver key. I hugged myself in excitement and picked it up. I tiptoed to the box, slotted the silver key inside the lock. The box sprang open at once. The box was packed to the brim with magical objects, tricks, and spells. Most of the stuff was way out of my league. I wasn't even allowed to handle magic like this yet. There was an invisibility powder, giant finger bones for telling the future, magic dust, a mini crystal ball, a dream kit, vials of dragon poison. I picked up an open jar full of green goo, sniffed and recoiled. Yuck! It smelt like a cross between old fish guts and a rancid camel's milk. I looked at the label. Sorcery slime, I read aloud. Smelly slime, more like. I put the jar on the desk and I continued rummaging in the box. I was so busy rifling about I didn't see the extra shadow on the wall at first. But at the back of my neck the hair stood on end. A dark shape appeared in the corner of my eye. I stopped, turned around slowly and squinted. It was a shadow and it was definitely growing. What was it? A tree branch? A cloud? The shadow grew bigger still. There was no tree. It had whiskers. Charlie, is that you? I whispered. I crossed my fingers. Maybe he'd ignored my instructions and followed me. Suddenly the air was split by a piercing scream. My blood ran cold. I'd heard that sound before and it wasn't Charlie. Out of the gloom leapt the dark shape of Mrs. Cuffy. She sprang on the desk and fixed me with ratty little eyes full of hate. The next thing I knew, she'd pushed me aside and jumped right into the magic box. Get out of there, I shouted, trying to pull her out. But Mrs. Cuffy was surprisingly strong for a rat. She used one back leg to hold the box lid open and grabbed at the spells and potions with her two front paws. She picked up anything that came to hand, shrunken lizards' heads, shark eyeballs, anything, and lobbed it at me. There was nothing I could do except duck. I watched helplessly as magical objects whizzed out of the box, past my ears and all over the floor. After about 10 seconds, Mrs. Cuffy's head popped out above the side of the box. Her whiskers twitched and she held up something in her front paws. It was a test tube filled with pink powder. This time she took careful aim before she threw it at me. I ducked out of the way of most of it, but a tiny bit scattered on my feet. To my horror, my feet immediately went numb. I stared down at them. Inside my trainers they grew smaller and smaller. As I lifted each one up, my socks and trainers fell off. My mouth dropped open. On each foot, my 5 toes had turned into 2 big toes and 1 small one. I rubbed my eyes hard. I no longer had humans' feet. I had pig's trotters. "Where are my feet?" I gasped. "Mrs. Coffey, what have you done to me?" I don't know if you've ever heard a rat laughing, but it's not a pretty sound. Mrs. Coffey clutched her sides as her furry, bony rat shoulders shook high-pitched giggles. Furious, I grabbed the open jar of saucery slime. "Right, you horrible creature," I shouted. "Two can play at that game." I threw the green slime all over Mrs. Coffey. For a moment she froze like a statue with her 2 front paws raised. Green gunk dripped off her fur. Then right in front of my eyes she changed, but not back into a human. Instead, her snout grew longer and so did her yellow teeth. Her tail shot out twice its length and sprouted black bristles to at the end. Her body doubled to twice its normal size until she was the size of a dog. Her brown greasy fur became shaggy and matted. Within a few seconds, Mrs. Coffey had changed from an ordinary brown rat into a mutant monster. She was still a rat, but not like any rat I'd ever seen before. She was huge. "Hell's teeth, what have I done now?" I whispered. I looked from Mrs. Coffey to my trotters and back again. I don't even think I could run away. I am so rat food. I backed into a corner as the monstrous Mrs. Coffey started stalking towards me. Chapter 9. A Late Night Conversation. My heart beat louder and louder as Mrs. Coffey stalked closer and closer. Then her ears twitched once and she stopped in her tracks. There was a noise outside the office. It sounded like footsteps. I closed my eyes. What if Mr. Coffey... Was it Mr. Coffey doing his rounds at the school, or was it Mrs. Wrinkle coming to collect her magic box? I don't know which was worse, being caught burgling the head's office or becoming a late supper for a dog-sized rodent. But Mrs. Coffey wasn't hanging around to see who was coming. She shot one last spiteful look at me and leapt towards the closed window. She crashed through it in a shower of splinters and was gone, leaving an enormous rat-shaped hole in the glass. The footsteps in the hall paused for a second and then came straight towards the office. I was caught like a cockroach in a glue trap. I snapped shut the lid of the magic box and threw the key in the drawer. I flung myself on the floor behind the desk and crouched down. The door creaked open. But it wasn't Mr. Coffey or Mrs. Winkle. Instead, peeping around the door, I saw the very last face I was expecting. "Mary," I said, standing up. "Ha!" she said. "Got you. I can't believe it. What are you doing here?" "I saw you climbing out of your bedroom window and I followed you," she said. "Anyway, never mind about me. What are you up to? And why is there all this weird stuff on the floor?" I didn't know where to start. I'd never told Mary I was a witch in case she didn't want to be friends with me anymore, but now she caught me behaving very strangely indeed. Maybe it was time I told the truth. I was so sick of all the lying. After all, Mary was my best friend. But what if she didn't believe me? What if she thought I was mad or lying? And what on earth was she going to say about my new feet who want to be best friends with a girl who had pig's trotters instead for toes? "Mary," I said, "sit down. I've got something to tell you." "You certainly have, madame," she said, plonking herself in a chair and crossing her arms. I took a deep breath and told Mary the whole story, nearly. She listened in silence, and I told her how Auntie Grizz and Auntie Wormella had adopted me, and how we all found out I was a natural-born witch. I told about how I studied magic outside school hours. I told her all about shape-shifting and all what I've done to Mrs. Coffey. I told her about running into Mrs. Coffey this evening, and finally I showed her my hideous pig feet. On the whole, Mary took it pretty well. She went quiet for a second and stared at me. I held my breath. Would she gang up with the other kids and tease me at school tomorrow? "Wow, Anna," she finally said as a smile crept across her face. "That's so cool. I would never have guessed. You look so ordinary." She paused, looked at my trotters and stifled a giggle. "Well, most of you does anyway," she said. "Thanks a lot," I said. "But where did all this stuff come from?" asked Mary, wrinkling her nose. "They're potions of mine from home," I lied. "I store them in school sometimes." Although I could tell Mary everything about myself, I couldn't breathe a word about Mrs. Winkle. That's the golden rule in witchcraft. One witch never tells on another. "Can you walk, Anna?" asked Mary. "We could stuff your socks into your trainers and jam your feet into them. They won't slip off and no one will notice." And that's when I knew it would be all right, that Mary was still on my side. My breath gushed out in a huge sigh of relief. Come on, I said, let's get going. All the way home, we chatted about witchcraft. It felt great to share it all with someone. Back in the warm kitchen in number 13 Crag Road, we tried to decide on what to do next. So the situation is, said Mary, finishing her coca, that instead of having an ordinary rat to worry about, we've got a monster mutant killer rodent on the loose. I hung my head. Charlie came and he snuggled between us and I tickled his ears. Not to mention, she said, that you've got feet like a farm animal and you don't know how to get rid of them. I keep trying to make things right, I said, but instead I just make things worse. Lucky for you, you've finally got some brains on board, she said. I suppose that means you, I said. Are you saying you'll help me? Of course, she said. We're friends, aren't we? I smiled, and for the first time in 2 days, maybe things were looking up. Right, I said. How are we going to find Mrs. Cuffy again before she finds me? Rats are creatures of habit, said Mary. She'll probably keep hanging around the school or somewhere else that's familiar. A light bulb seemed to go on my head. That's it. I bet she's near her old home. The Cuffy's house backs right onto the school. That's why she keeps popping up all over the place. Yes, that makes sense, said Mary. But what's she living on? Didn't you tell me that rats scavenge food scraps, I said, and the school kitchen dustbins are at the bottom of the Cuffy's garden? We'll start there. Well done, genius, yawned Mary, but what do we do with her when we find her? She's no longer your average rat, is she? Not now that you've had another go at her. My shoulders slumped. I need to think about this, I said. I need to get out my magic books and learn how to change that monster back into Mrs. Cuffy. I can shapeshift all right, but I'm not very good at changing things back. So I see, said Mary, yawning again. Can I go now? I have to get some sleep before school. Lucky you, I said, stretching my arms out. I've got too much to do to sleep. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye, porkers, said Mary, grinning. I scowled. 5 minutes later, Charlie and I were on my bed in the attic, surrounded by all my spell books. I was determined to stay awake all night and find a spell that would sort out Miss Cuffy once and for all. 2 minutes after that, I was lying on top of the books, dribbling. I was fast asleep.